Now, it's time for Modern Money Doughnuts with Stephen Hale and Gabrielle Bond.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Modern Money Doughnuts. My name's Stephen Hale. I'm Adjunct Associate Professor at Torrens University here in South Australia, and I'm here with my colleague, Gabrielle Bond, and another guest who Gabrielle's going to introduce.
Hi everyone, my name's Gabrielle Bond. I'm an activist and organiser. I'm with the Sustainable Prosperity Action Group and also I'm a director at Modern Money Lab. And we're here today, thank you so much for joining us, Dirk. Dr Dirk Ehnts is an adjunct lecturer at the Magdeburg Stendal University of Applied Scientists, and he's speaker of the board of the Pufendorf Society for Political Economy and author of Modern Monetary Theory and European Macroeconomics, among much else. Dirk's been very kind to allow us to list him as an adjunct lecturer at Modern Money Lab as well. And the plan is for Dirk to write and teach a subject on our new Torrens University graduate program next year.
Yeah,
Thanks very much for coming along.
Very excited to be here. Thank you for the introduction.
So first question for you. The USA and Australia are monetary unions of states, as is the Eurozone, but they don't work in the same way. How do they differ and why does this matter?
Well, I think the main difference between Australia and the Eurozone is that Australia has a federal government, whereas in the Eurozone, we only have the European Commission, which is the European Union body, and not specific to the Eurozone. So we have a central bank in many countries, but we have no federal government that, for example, like in Australia, could spend as much money as it wants to. I mean, maybe there are fiscal rules, but technically, at least, the federal government in Australia can spend as much money as it wants to, and we don't have. So that is the biggest difference, I would say. So at least in practice, we have these kind of rules, the deficit rules. So the national governments of the Eurozone, they also can spend money via their national central banks. So whereas you have the Australian central bank, we have the European central bank, and then we have 90 national central banks, and all of them together form our central bank. It's a little bit complicated.
Yeah, much more complicated.
Yeah, it's called the Euro system, and that means that the national governments, they pay their bills by using their own national central banks, but if they spend more than 3% more than they take back in taxes, then the European Commission can at least theoretically punish them for what we call an excessive deficit. And these rules were, at the start of the European Union, or the Eurozone, these rules were enforced. But in 2019, so before the pandemic, we had 10 countries which were in excessive deficits, meaning public deficits. And only one of them was punished. So only Romania was punished in 2019 for an excessive deficit. So we have changed the rules a little bit already by not enforcing them even before the pandemic. And then, of course, it's more or less very similar that the Australian government is more or less like the German government or the Greek government even, so they can spend whatever they want. And there's political rules that might be binding or might not be binding, but it's not so far from Australia then.
So the essential difference really is that Australia is one government with one central bank, which is the case for really most countries around the world across monetary history and outside the Eurozone, most countries around the world today. And if our federal government passes a budget through our parliament, then it's able to fund its spending. We have a slightly different system to the US and Canada and other countries in terms of ensuring that the dollars are always available for the federal government to spend. But all of those countries have some kind of system to ensure that once there is political authorization for spending to go ahead, then the funds are always available. Whereas in the Eurozone, it's different. It's especially different if you're one of the smaller economies and post GFC, one of the Southern European economies, where you don't have the unquestioned backing of a central bank to ensure that you can always fund your spending. That's basically what I took from your explanation there, Dirk.
Yeah, but it's politically complicated. Okay,
Yeah.
so the Eurozone was planned in a way that we said the financial market should punish the national governments. So those governments which overspend, having high deficits, should be punished through higher interest rates. In the Eurozone, we discovered the hard way that if the central bank does not buy up government bonds and supports the national governments, then of course something can happen like what happened to Greece in 2014, that the Greek government ran out of money. It could not sell any more government bonds, and that meant that the central bank was unwilling to pay its bills, because it's how it connects. So in a way, the Eurozone setup is more MMT-like than anywhere else, I think. So if the German government spends, for example, the Bundesbank, our central bank here in Germany, they just pay the bills of the government, and then the account of the government is in negative territory, and they have to fill it up with tax revenues and also with bond issuance revenues. But it's not like in the US, for example, where the government first needs to issue bonds, then it spends. So the German central bank allows the German federal government to spend first and then fill up the account. So everything that, or any, no, wait a sec. The only thing that matters, let me put it like this, is whether you find a buyer for your government bonds.
Okay.
ECB, through its purchases of government bonds, can make sure that all the banks who are buying the government bonds from the national countries, that they can always expect to have a buyer of last resort. So if the ECB says, yes, we have lots of government bonds, then there's no question about solvency and liquidity of national governments, including Greece. But if they don't do this, like they did in the Euro crisis, then of course the Greek government can actually run out of money. And in terms of the legal system, the monetary system, of course, is based on laws. So what does the ECB say? The ECB says, well, the spreads, so the bond price differences, which we have between those national bonds, like German government bonds, Greek government bonds, they have different bond prices because investors expect maybe that some countries are not doing very well in terms of I don't know, efficient government spending, whatever the investors think about. So the ECB says there are certain spreads and they reflect macroeconomic differences in those countries. But if the spreads get out of hand, then we are there to ensure that they come back to normal, more or less. So this means that the ECB, while it has admitted that the spreads are a feature, not a bug, the ECB has also now, at least by verbal means, expressed its will to make sure that national governments will never run out of money again. But of course, it's not very reliable. Okay, so if you're a small country like Greece, I mean, in the pandemic, of course, the Greek government debt to GDP ratio, it topped 200%. Okay, so there was a huge public debt and nothing happened because the ECB was supportive. And the ECB can support because it can take its own decisions. It's not a government-run body. So the German chancellor, for example, has no power to intervene. So if the ECB says that it will make sure that the national governments can spend, then this is a new situation. So we have, in a way, a Eurozone 2.0.
Wow, yeah.
So
That pretty much covers our second question. But yeah, go ahead, Stephen.
Well, it does. I've just, again, just from memory, what Dirk is reminding me of there is that as the Eurozone was originally set up, there was no guarantee that the European Central Bank would support any government initially. They certainly are not supposed to lend to governments, but also it was extremely limited, the conditions under which they were to buy government bonds in the second-hand market as well. That changed after the global financial crisis, because had it not changed, the whole Eurozone would have crashed. The fact that this was likely to happen, as I know Dirk knows because I've read him referring to this elsewhere, was predicted by one of the favourite uncles of modern monetary theory, Wynne Godley, almost as soon as the rules for the Eurozone and the European Central Bank were first agreed on in the early 1990s. But even after the GFC, once the European Central Bank stood behind national governments, this was conditional, and it was conditional on governments obeying what were originally convergence criteria and then ended up being called the Stability and Growth Pact. And that's what Dirk was referring to when he talked about the 3% rule.
Yeah,
governments
right.
keeping their deficits below 3% of GDP. And that meant that governments of countries like Greece, but not just Greece, the other southern European countries as well, had some default risk associated with their bonds without the guaranteed backing of a central bank. So unlike the US or Australia, even though they were borrowing in the currency they used, what you might regard as the national currency, Spain, Portugal, Ireland, Italy, but especially Greece, were seen as being at risk of not paying back their debt, not paying interest and not repaying what they borrowed from bondholders. And unfortunately, when that becomes believed by the investment community, then, as Dirk said, he talked about spreads increasing. That means the interest rates these governments have to pay start taking off and going into the stratosphere, so that it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. And without the European Central Bank and the other European governments coming along and preventing this happening, then Greece would have defaulted, perhaps Spain, Portugal, perhaps other countries too. And perhaps there would be no Eurozone now. So that's where you said Dirk had dealt with this, which was this crisis happened after the global financial crisis. But actually we have had what has in some ways been a worse crisis happening in the last couple of years. And we haven't seen the same situation where the Eurozone has appeared to be on the brink, where governments like the Greek government have been at risk of default. Why is that, Dirk?
Yeah, well, I think the European policymakers understood that austerity policies were not a good idea. So this idea of trying to reduce the deficit by cutting government spending, which the Eurozone did extensively in the 2010s, which you just referred to, especially in Greece. They cut public salaries by 20%. They cut government spending. And all of this was deflationary. It created mass unemployment, and it was really bad. So it was kind of clear that the rules didn't work, the fiscal rules. So the 3% rule, the Stability and Growth Pact, is where this deficit rule is enshrined. They inserted in the early 2000s, the early 2010s, they inserted a general escape clause in the Stability and Growth Pact, which was not there before. So they said, well, next time we move into a crisis, let's have the option here that we kind of can turn off these deficit limits if we need to. Okay, so of course it was a bad time in the 2010s to live in Spain, Portugal, and Greece, because the Troika, which was the ECB, the European Commission, and the IMF, they went into those countries and said, look, if you want to have some money, you need to reform. And of course, there was the neoliberal reforms that they did. And they said, well, it will hurt in the short term, but the Greeks will prosper in the 2020s, for example, in the long term. And
or
of course,
in the 2060s, maybe.
Yeah, well,
Wonder.
that kind. Okay, so Greece is still the poor man of the Eurozone. And what they promised in terms of efficient markets and liberalized markets and flexible workers and so on, all of that, it doesn't help. And it was often a reduced wages, you reduce demand for companies, so the companies are complaining because profits are low. So I think that European policymakers, also European public, they have learned that the 2010s, the response to the global financial crisis was a disaster, because other countries that did not look at the deficit, like the US, they just said, well, okay, the deficit will take care of itself. We just increase government spending, and then the economy will bounce back, and then we have a smaller deficit, whatever it will be. So that seemed to be the right path. And in 2020, in March, the ECB said we will have a public bond purchase program, which was called the Pandemic Emergency Purchase Program. And by this, we ensure that all the national governments can sell all the government bonds they need to sell in order to fill up their accounts with their central banks, so that they would spend for them, that they would have a green light. And then the Stability and Growth Pact was deactivated. So the General Escape Clause was activated in 2020 in April by the European Commission after the European Council, I think, proposed to do this. And that meant that deficit limits were off, and also the fiscal stuff that was also there was also off. Also, the national debt breaks were deactivated. And that meant that the monetary sovereignty returned to all the countries of the Eurozone. Okay, so from 2020 onwards, it was clear that until the end of this year, the debt limits were off. So what normally stopped a country from spending more was the problem that they could not sell any more bonds because the investors might panic. There's no problem now. The ECB is buying lots of bonds. And also you would stop spending at some point because you were afraid of the 3% public deficit limit. But now you can breach that too. So there's nothing that stops the Eurozone governments to do this. And guess what happened? The unemployment rate is at an historical low right now. Okay, so it was never below 7% for about 20 years that we have the euro now. It was never below 7%, which is a very high unemployment rate, and now it's 6 point something. Okay, so turning off fiscal deficit limits leads us towards full employment. And of course, it had to happen. That's what held us back. So I think that policymakers have now understood quite clearly that the deficit limits are harmful for the European economy. And given that we have the war,
true,
and we now have the war in Ukraine, so they will probably also say for next year that the Stability and Growth Pact will be deactivated. So this has become a new normal, that the monetary sovereignty is back with those nation states, which of course is not something that we planned for. That's not how the euro was designed. That is right now the only possible way the euro can work.
So I remember Fidel Kaboub was talking in one lecture about countries being on a spectrum of monetary sovereignty. And so do you think that in general, most countries are moving towards more monetary sovereignty?
Well, I mean, in the Eurozone, the way that we have designed those institutions, we are moving from very little monetary sovereignty now. I mean, right now and since April 2020, we have full monetary sovereignty. Okay, there's nothing that would stop the national governments. Of course, you can turn on monetary sovereignty. You can turn off monetary sovereignty when you reintroduce the Stability and Growth Pact. But there's already now a debate about how to reform the fiscal rules of the Eurozone. It was to be decided this year, but because of the war in Ukraine, it will be decided next year, I guess. So there is talk, and on this kind of spectrum, we're definitely moving towards more monetary sovereignty. But of course, it's also a political question. So there's lots of people who want to have a United States of Europe. So they are saying, well, the European Commission should be allowed to go into debt to issue also their currency by having the ECB pay their bills. So we had something which we call Next Generation EU, which was, I think, roughly a couple of 100 billion euros extra, partly in loans to national governments, but partly also as a gift, more or less. So this would allow then the European Union to become more like Australia, like a proper European nation state, if you want, with federal institutions and all of this. So in the background, we have this political question: what do we want to do with Europe? And the solution right now is to give monetary sovereignty back to the nation states, because we cannot have a federal government in Brussels that quickly. We would have to reform a lot of institutions to get there. But all of this is in flux, and it's in the end it's a political situation that we have here, and the economic situation often adjusts to what is politically possible, which is why the Eurozone and its institutional framework is so disappointing in a way. It's easy to criticize it, and it's easy to see the flaws, but you need political majorities to move ahead and to change it.
Well, I think we dodged a bullet in France with Marine Le Pen missing out on the presidency, which is a good thing.
Yeah, and that's exactly the point that I try to stress. It's the high unemployment rates which are killing the European politics. Okay, so because we have some kind of vacuum. I mean, if you're unemployed in Australia and you want to vote, we will increase employment, and we make sure that people who want to work and can work will find a job. Let's have a job guarantee, for instance. We can't have that in Europe, because on the national level, the parties will say, sorry, we cannot increase government spending because of the deficit limits. So our hands are tied behind our backs. We can't do anything. I mean, we can pretend that we will, but it's clearly that clearly not possible. And Brussels will say, so during the European elections, well, the whole budget of the European Commission is roughly 1% of European GDP. They will say we can't do anything because we are not allowed to deficit spend. Okay, so technically we get tax revenues and that's our budget.
Yes,
so if you're unemployed and angry in Europe, what do you do politically? And that's why the
far right has that
political danger has I mean the far right monopolized kind of these frustrated people and their anger, and that's a bad thing.
It's a very complicated set of questions, that one, isn't it? How it's very difficult to see at least some of the member countries of the Eurozone ever opting for a genuinely federal government, but it's difficult to know what to do.
Yeah, we are kind of stuck. In terms, I like this metaphor that in the Eurozone, we started riding our horse into a river, and then we were in the middle. We kind of noticed that the river is too deep. So now what do? Do we turn back and say, let's go back to national currencies? Or do we try to teach the horse to swim and say, okay, I mean, there's a lot of uncertainty, but let's try to go ahead. And of course, I mean, these kind of questions, like whether to have a federal European nation state or not. I mean, I would like to think as a democratic citizen, or as a citizen in a democracy, I would like to say, let's have a public debate and fix it by public debate. But historically, this is now not how it's done. It's backroom politics.
It takes much time too. Like the changes that we need, we don't have time to kind of talk to everybody in order to act on climate change. I struggle with that a lot because there's lots of people here who are very interested in the sort of participatory democracy, citizens' assemblies model. And to be fair, it's probably better than what we've currently got. But do we have time? No, probably not. Anyway, that's another question.
It's then that you start acting in terms of emergency laws. So you have a crisis like the pandemic. You have a crisis like the Ukraine war, and then you just say, okay, I react to the crisis, and it's a little bit like the book, The Shock Therapy. Where the author writes that you have to react to shocks, and this is how you legitimize your decisions. And for example, the euro, there was always talk about countries exiting the euro and maybe somehow dissolving the currency union. With what happened in Ukraine, this is not a big debate anymore for the rest of the decade. So because there's the Russian war on Ukraine has unified the rest of the Europeans. It would not be politically possible to say, let's dissolve the euro now. If you are a political party, people want more Europe. They want solidarity. They want to stand together, and that means that, oddly enough, but one of the unintended consequences of this war in Russia is that the euro will be much more stable politically than we thought it would be, and there's much more momentum for reform right now. So I think the next fiscal framework that we get in the eurozone, it's not going to be perfect. But I think it will be much more better, and we will have much lower unemployment rates in the future with whatever we get. And
that would be I don't like to say it would be good news, because what's happening in the Ukraine is absolutely dreadful. But it would at least be something. It would be a positive outcome anyway. And in a way, moving towards. I remember Warren Mosler talking years ago about, instead of having a 3% limit on deficit spending, sometimes you need an 8% limit, or you need much more flexibility to make the system work. It's moving in that direction.
So one thing might be to turn off these deficit limits completely and say we have instead employment targets, for example. So there's now room for these kind of debates, and these kind of employment targets are floated as an idea, which again, it's progress. So in terms of politics, again, we're moving ahead, and MMT is becoming more mainstream with these kind of ideas that you should target full employment and price stability, and not only exclusively price stability as the ECB is doing now. So
Absolutely. They should have listened to Win Godley in the first place when designing the Eurozone. And it would be good to listen to MMT economists like Dirk when thinking about which direction to go in the future, whether it is for a federal Europe or whether it's a Europe of nation states, but with much greater flexibility as far as fiscal policy and the support of the ECB is concerned. Gabrielle, sorry.
Yeah, I just wanted to say we did have some slides of a paper that you've written, Dirk.
That would be great. Since you mentioned MMT, now you published a paper earlier this year, Dirk. You can see a screenshot that I took on the slides called Modern Monetary Theory, the Right Compass for Decision Making, in a journal called Intereconomics. What motivated you to write this paper?
Well, there were two authors affiliated with the Banque de France, the French central bank, and they wrote a paper which was called, I think, was Modern Monetary Theory, the Wrong Compass for Decision Making, something along those lines. I thought that it's great that central bankers do engage with MMT, and they look at the arguments and they try to they can use it for their own decisions. So I mean, it's really the right kind of framing. So is MMT a good compass for decision making? That's really a very good question. But the problem is that they have read parts of MMT literature, like some essentials. They also read a paper that I wrote about Georg Friedrich Knapp, the chartalist economist from the 19th century and early 20th century. But they were kind of lost in the details. And they created this table where they said, okay, this is what MMT says, and this is what we say, or what the mainstream says. Yeah, there it is. And I think apart from, there was one row where they got it right, but there were many rows where it was not correct, or at least it is debatable whether it was correct in the framing that they used with those mainstream words. So I said, it's a nice idea to challenge them and say, look, let me try to put it straight. So this is what we think MMT is. And maybe we can engage in a discussion about how the government of France actually spends, so that we can discuss something positive. So let's not get stuck with the details about chartalism and where MMT is coming from and which kind of ideas it's building on. That's all history of economic thought, and it's interesting for its own sake. But if we are interested in whether MMT can be used by central banks and policymakers as a compass, then we should discuss something more practical. And yeah, that was the outcome, this kind of papers that I published. I had lots of help, so I would also like to thank Pavlina Tcherneva for her help in commenting on that paper. So yeah.
These two economists, they were from the Bank of France, I think. Yeah. So we've put up the first half of table one. There's loads of things we could discuss from Dirk's paper. Actually, one or two things he referred to a little bit earlier on in our discussion. For example, he in the paper he talks about using balance sheets, how the German government spends and how it interacts with Germany's central bank, which is a member of the European system of central banks. But I just wanted to take a look at this table, because in this table we have, or you've listed a variety of issues in macroeconomics with the mainstream or neoclassical view, with Doughnut's and Pfister's interpretation of what they think modern monetary theory has to say about these issues. And then it says original MMT, we might perhaps say genuine MMT in the right-hand column there. And I thought maybe if we've got a few minutes, we could have a look at some of these, and perhaps you could just explain the difference between their interpretation of modern monetary theory and what you've written in the right-hand column. So the first one, for example, government spending is financed by, we're all familiar with the mainstream view, taxes paid for government spending. Doughnut and Pfister, they say issuing currency, according to MMT, finances government spending. You say it's not finance. What do you mean by that, Dirk?
Well, I think it's the question here is how do you define the word finance? you can just be sloppy and say, well, finance means to be paid for. Okay, so then it would be technically correct to say that MMT says that you are financing government expenditure by issuing currency. Stephanie Kelton often puts it like this. She doesn't. At least in Germany, the word finance is very specific. That means you have to have some kind of income before you spend some kind of money. Okay, so that means you need money in order to spend money. And then, of course, MMT says that the central bank, which is making the payments for the government, it's a currency issuer. And as currency issuer, you can only spend, but you cannot finance. Okay, there's no technical possibility to finance. If you go back to Virginia, for example, in the 18th century, they had their own paper currency. Okay, so it was not able for them to finance that. They didn't need tax revenues, which is the mainstream view, and they even could not use tax revenues for financing. Okay, so whether you are using new paper currency or you kind of recycle paper currency, it's a question of sustainable resource use, but it's not a question about whether you are able to spend or not. Okay, so that's why I said in the MMT view, the currency issuer does not finance at all. It just spends. So the central bank, and now we are talking about modern Germany. So if the German federal government spends, the German central bank will mark up the account of the receiving bank using its computer system. Those numbers are not coming from anywhere. So if you are using finance in that kind of sense, with this kind of definition, you would not believe that the government can finance anything at all.
Yeah.
So very, very interesting. I sometimes, again, rather sloppily say that it's financed when you pass a spending bill through Parliament. But that's just, I guess.
Could be just a language thing, right?
Yeah. The interesting thing is to have these discussions. I think people understand much better. If somebody says government spend by issuing currency or government spending is not financed, technically, yes, it's not financed. The government doesn't need to raise taxes before it can spend or borrow before it can spend. And the political authorization bit feeds into the second row here. Yeah. Public debt sustainability can be an issue. Investors can go on bond strike. Governments can't raise money. They can't finance their spending. That's the mainstream view, or at least I don't know whether they write these things down anymore, but it's not that many years before that was the typical thing which mainstream economists wrote about the risk in their view of the national debt increasing over time. Drummets and Pfister, it cannot be an issue. You say, and again, I think this is the right way of putting it, but better you explain it than me. It's a political issue if debt is in your own currency.
Yeah.
What does that mean?
I mean, I think Drummets and Pfister probably read American MMT articles and books, and there, of course, Randy Rayo, for example, often says this, that the government cannot run out of money, so public debt sustainability is not an issue. But if you would read his stuff about the Eurozone, there, of course, he would say, well, in the Eurozone, it depends. But we kind of normally think that it's one country, one currency, and all the central banks are supporting the governments, also because the government can change the laws. So they can force, by changing the law, can force the central bank to support the government and make sure that the government can spend. So in the Eurozone, you can clearly see it's a political issue. Okay, so it's really odd that you have 19 countries which share a currency. Let me also point out that we also have a country which has two currencies, which is China. They have the renminbi and also the Hong Kong dollar. So there's also this kind of arrangement. But I would rather say that it's still national currencies. So I would still say that Germany is issuing its own currency. It's called the euro. And other currencies or other countries can also issue this currency. Okay, but every euro that is spent by the German government is created by the German central bank. So it's not that the German federal government is spending a currency it does not have, for example, it cannot create. So the Bundesbank can create as many euros as it wants to, as it is allowed to legally. Christine Lagarde, the ECB president, she said in November 2020 that the ECB and the national central banks, as the sole issuers of euro, can create any amount of liquidity needed. Okay, so we have that on record. So it's only a political issue. So maybe the Bundesbank at one point will say, look, we can still create money, but we cannot pay the bills for the German federal government because their account is negative and they're not able to bring it back to zero because they cannot sell government bonds and tax revenues are not enough to bring it back to zero. And if that is the case, then you have a red light at the central bank. So they cannot mark up the account of banks if the government of Germany tells them to do that. That means it's a political issue, and it's the monetary constitution in a way that fixes this. But in this case, the ECB is able to fix this issue because they can create these kind of bond purchase programs on the secondary market, and thus ensure that you will always find a buyer for German government bonds or Greek government bonds. And it's nevertheless, it's a political decision made by the ECB board. And it's kind of strange because it's not a democratic institution, but they have all the power regarding this question in the Eurozone.
Go on, Gabby.
I was just going to ask, do you think the kind of average person in the street would actually understand this, or is it, are they still sort of operating under the deficit myth?
Let me think about this for a while. No, they don't understand. Okay, so so they are still more or less, the whole debate is still framed in terms of this mainstream idea. But I just published a new book in German. It was published with Springer in February, and it has more than 3,500 downloads inside the first roughly 2 months.
Any chance for a translation, Dirk, for those of us that don't speak German?
Yeah, I hope that Springer will do it. They have the English translation rights. I hope that if I sell 10,000 copies this year in German, maybe they're willing to translate it. I have other language rights, so for those who speak other non-English languages, maybe there's hope that the translation will be coming out soon.
Okay, that's great. I've just gone onto the third slide because we're not going to keep Dirk all night. Actually, some of what we've just been talking about is related to the other issues which he covers in this table, which are he brilliantly covers in the article. This is one of my favorite MMT papers in recent years, which is why I wanted to highlight it now. People can see the link, at least the address of the link, which is on the screen at the moment, or you can just do a Google search for Dirk Ehnts' name and Modern Monetary Theory, the Right Compass for Decision Making, and you'll find this paper. I strongly advise you to read it. It's fascinating, and Dirk's discussion of Table 1, the contents of Table 1, as much as the remaining content of the paper, is an education in itself. But I think we'll leave the discussion there, or we'll keep Dirk all day, and we'll keep us all night. This is absolutely fascinating, though. And I'd just like to thank Dirk for his work. You are, I often think, ploughing a lonely furrow, Dirk. You're the leading European modern monetary theory economist.
Right.
As far as Germany is concerned, it sometimes seems to me like you're the only modern monetary theory economist. Or do I have the wrong impression?
No, I've had one student, Maurice Höfgen, who also published a book in German about modern monetary theory, and he works as a research assistant in the German parliament. So we are also getting this stuff into politics through him, and he has a very successful blog and podcast like you do. So yeah, I'm very happy to be on this show. So thanks for
I need you to get a lot more famous, Dirk. I mean, we need him to get a lot more famous as well, because that's why most people don't understand these issues. Gabrielle, there are 10,000 of them for every one of us.
Yeah.
It seems sometimes when it comes to the conversation, and we get drowned out.
We're very excited that Dirk is going to be part of our Modern Money Lab and Torrens University collaborative venture, which is, gathering steam. We're due to launch, to have applications open, formal applications open from mid-July. And we will be launching our 2 foundation topics in September, which Stephen and our friend Phil Lawn are working on as we speak. And if you want to find out more about those postgraduate courses, go to our website, which is www.modernmoneylab.org.au, and you'll find our courses right on the homepage. And there's also a whole page devoted to them as well.
And next week, we are going to talk to someone we've been promising people we'd be talking to for weeks now, but finally, I think we've got it lying down, who is actually the chair of Modern Money Lab and one of the most prominent fund managers in Australia, Con Michalakis. So it'll be great to talk to Con.
Yeah.
But I
Terrific.
think it only remains for us to thank Dirk again very much for talking to us. It's been fascinating, Dirk. Thanks so much for talking to us today. And to say Joe Firestone is on after us, as usual. And we'll see everybody next week.
Yeah.
Oh, hang on. We should, I think there's something else we should do before we finish. Dirk, is there anything that you would like to bring to people's attention that you're working on later this year yourself?
Well, I mean, I will be part of the Levy Institute summer seminar this year.
Oh, yes.
That is a great event.
I saw your name on that today because a friend and colleague of ours is applying to attend.
Yeah. Well,
and I should say that where I first met Dirk was it was the Hyman Minsky summer seminar.
Oh, yes.
In those days, in 2012, in the very same place, the Levy Institute at Bard College, beautiful Annandale on Hudson. Anyone who ever gets the chance to go and visit, they should do. I think you're presenting over the net. Are you, or are you actually going there?
I will be there in person.
Oh, wow. Oh, that's absolutely marvelous.
Yeah, I'm excited to go.
It's probably too late to apply now. I guess all the places are taken up. But if there's anybody watching who's going to go, it's a fantastic experience. When Dirk and I were there, we heard then from Stephanie, Kelton, Randy, Ray, Matt Forstutter, Fadel Kaboub, Pavlina Cherneva, Scott Fulweiler, as well as a variety of leading post-Keynesians and others who wouldn't use the modern monetary theory label for themselves. It was a wonderful experience. I very much remember chatting to Dirk and talking about the overlap, or that there ought to be an overlap between post-Keynesian economics and behavioral economics. And you were going to launch a web page with what was it going to be called? I've got Endogenous Monkey.
Yeah, right.
That was what you were going to call it.
Yeah, that was the human behavior associated with the endogenous money creation.
Yeah,
we would be endogenous monkeys.
That's it.
Because biologically, we are monkeys.
Anyway, if you're going, you're in for a great treat with all the amazing presenters, and Bill Mitchell as well this year, and Dirk, of course. And if there is anybody watching now, please make a point of going and saying hello to Dirk when you're at the Levy Institute. And thanks again, Dirk, for being with us.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you, Gabby. Thank you, Stephen.
Thanks. See ya. Thanks again.
All right. Yeah. Cool.
And